everybody, welcome back to my channel. I know it's been a little while. I've spent a lot of time being abroad, so I haven't really been around to make content, but Champions is on right now, and I want to talk about it. So I'm obviously not working the event, but I have been doing my best to keep a lot of analysis notes throughout the course of the event so far, and I wanted to talk about a game that is actually happening today, so I really hope I get this video up in time, and that is Envy versus Acend. Now, this was originally supposed to be Envy versus vetoes, and I stayed up really late last night prepping for that video, but vetoes actually used a camera exploit on the Breeze map versus Acend, and as a direct result have basically had to forfeit the game and be moved down to the lower bracket and Acend up to the upper bracket. They have ascended. Okay. So I just want to talk about some of my expectations and questions that I have about this game going into it. So let's go. Firstly, I want to talk about what I'm expecting for the map vetoes. Now, this was actually something I found much easier to try and think about when it was Envy versus vetoes, but I think with Envy versus Acend, there is a little bit more of an overlap in their map preferences that make it harder to predict whether or not they're going to target ban at their own detriment, or if they are going to go along with what they would prefer to play. So if we have a look at what they've banned so far, Envy have so far in this tournament banned Fracture and Icebox and picked Ascent, and Acend have so far banned Haven and Split and picked Bind. Now, these two teams did not play against each other in Masters Berlin, unlike Envy and vetoes, so we don't have a prior experience of what they like to bring out to go by. Now, my predictions for the initial bans are going to be Envy banning Fracture and Acend banning Haven. Envy have shown that Fracture is kind of this map they don't really want to play. They're also not the kind of team who are going to necessarily ban to what the opponent wants to play. Envy usually like to stick to their own band. Like, Breeze was always that map for them. They never really wavered on that. As for Acend, they don't really like Haven. Envy have shown to be pretty good at Haven in the past. Also, I think Acend are probably going to be okay with the idea of playing Fracture. They did play it in the LVB Rising tournament, and I suspect they've been boot camping it as well. So my predictions for those bans are Fracture and Haven. Now, assuming that Fracture and Haven are banned, I think it's likely that we see Bind get picked by Acend. Now, this is one of those maps that both of these teams are good at. So in theory, it could go in the banning phase, just if they want to get rid of it. But because both of these teams really like Bind, I would not be surprised to see it stay in. Acend have a higher win percentage on Bind than Envy do, 86% versus 66%. And they've had a much better track record on it of recent history. They have won it 22 out of the last 23 times that they have played this map. So it's pretty insane. Now, in response, I could see Envy picking Acend, but given the fact that they just played it yesterday against X10, it wouldn't surprise me too much if they did want to go with something else, in which case I could see Breeze or Split coming up. Split mostly just because it would probably make Acend a little bit uncomfortable, but I actually think both of these map choices would be weaker for them than Acend, so I would like to see them pick Acend in this situation. As for the second bans after that, I think it would probably be Envy picking Icebox and then Acend picking Split to leave Breeze as the decider map. So that would put my predicted maps for this series at Bind, Acend, and Breeze. Now, to look at their playstyles at Champs so far, both of these teams have, of course, only played one series each. They've only played their first game. So we're basing this off of quite limited information. And I've tried not to lean too much into how we've seen them play in the past, because even though Masters was the last major event, there's been a lot of time between then. So I don't think that's a super viable way to predict how they're going to play. So let's have a look at Acend first. So the really big thing with Acend is the way that their duelists play. Ened actually statistically had a pretty good day yesterday, but Zeke actually outclassed him in the KD and the number of kills that he got as well. He had a plus 11 KD at 34 to 23, but Ened did do better than him on the opening kills to opening deaths with a plus 5 versus plus 2. Either way, we can conclude from that both of the duelists on Acend have done pretty well so far. One thing that we can say is the players from Acend have actually been incredibly consistent. If we look at the statistics from Icebox and Bind, we can't look at Breeze. Those statistics have been rescinded. The order of the ranking of the players at the end of the map has actually been the same for both of them, which has gone CNED, Zeke, Killez, Starzo, and Bone Cold. So we know that they are sticking to these very consistent ways of playing and performing consistently as well. Now, Acend were taking quite a lot of aggressive defensive positions. They were really happy to encroach on the attackers very early on in the round, actually. And I think a lot of this, it was definitely facilitated by the fact that VivoKeyed weren't running a ton of flank watch. Instead, what they would oftentimes rely upon is really good trade potential within their team fights, which did many times actually work against Acend, but that was something that they were doing quite a lot. Whether or not that was a couple of players who were doing the encroaching together, or if it was just Zeke on his own, which did happen a couple of times on Icebox, it was definitely a pattern within their playstyle. I think it's definitely fair to say that they didn't always have what appeared to be the most coordinated team fights, especially at times where, let's say, the attackers rotated to a different site and the defenders, as Acend, wanted to respond to that. Sometimes as they were converging in on a site that was already being planted on or had already been planted on, a lot of their team fights would go a little bit messy because they weren't necessarily in the best positions to deal with it or just responding to it as well as they could have. That said, I really want to call out Bone Cold as being a really fun Sova. It was something they spoke about on the desk actually at the beginning of the game, is that Bone Cold, typically you would see him play a lot of these controller roles, but he's been picking up Sentinels a lot more of late. And I thought that some of his utility usage was actually really smart. There were times where they baited in VivoKeyed to use their own utility, and then they would still be saving a lot of their Sova util for later on in the round. For example, the drone, which obviously, unlike the recon dart, is not regenerative, so you can only use it once, and being able to have that later on in the round after you've already forced your opponent to use theirs early was incredibly valuable to Acend a couple of times. When we specifically looked at how they were playing on Bind, they were very effective at taking control of A-Long and Showers when they were on their attack. And especially as VivoKeyed weren't running a particularly strong hookah defense, very rarely had someone actually placed in hookah. It meant that even if Acend had control of those spaces towards the A site but wanted to switch over to B, they could use the teleporter very easily, have that control of mid, and move in through hookah. And it made their bind attacks incredibly valuable, powerful. It made them so hard for VivoKeyed to deal with, and that's part of the reason that Acend took so many attacking rounds on that map. You consider as well the fact that you basically have free control of so many of the orbs too. So you're going to be in this huge ult advantage as well on top of your opponent. It was very, very well played from them. I was definitely happy as well with the decision to put Zeke on Raze on Bind. A lot of teams have been moving away from this Raze on Bind, but I think that being able to play a Raze gives you a lot of forward control that you don't necessarily have with other agents. For example, on the defense, you can have a direct hookah and mid control in a way that you can't with other agents. But one thing that he was doing especially well on attack was being able to brute force his way into U-Haul and taking that space from the defenders, particularly leading with a showstopper, which is just something that VivoKeyed didn't have as an option in retaliation. And speaking of Bone Cold, once again, he was back on the controller role for Bind. He was playing Brimstone, which again is an agent that many teams have moved away from. But I thought his use of Molotovs was really good, not just in you know, the kind of way to deny a defuse in the way that many people will use, I don't know, a Killjoy, a Viper, all sorts of different agents, but also at times where Acend were down a couple of men and he wanted to cut off routes that the opponents would be able to use, that Acend didn't have enough manpower to watch, and actually that would win rounds a couple times. So I thought that that was really good. So now let's have a look at the way that Envy played. They also have only played one game, of course, and that was against X10. So I think Envy have definitely shown a lot of growth. They've obviously been willing to grow their map pool because they brought Breeze in, which was their kind of hard ban back in Masters Berlin. And not only that, but they've actually started to implement more agents because they've picked up the KO. It's something that FNS in their post-game interview yesterday spoke about being slightly inspired by the way 100 Thieves and Cloud9 played, and they actually think that KO is a vastly underrated agent and has a really strong set of utilities. So I expect that's something that we'll see more from them, but to see them bring that in and try something new has been really exciting, even if just for one series so far. Envy also showed a lot of consistency, but in a slightly different way to how Acend did. In the case of Envy, it was more about everyone having very similar statistics. Every player was positive KD. The highest was Ye at +12. The lowest was Victor at +4. All players but Victor had an ACS of +200. The highest was Ye at 245. The lowest was Victor at 185. And the only negative opening kill to opening death ratio was Victor with -1, but Ye was the highest at +4. So again, you had the same guy at the top, the same guy at the bottom, but the statistics were much closer as a range than what they were on Acend. Similarly to Acend, again, Envy had some examples of early defensive aggression as well, where they would just be happy to just like push through cave on Breeze onto the attackers who are still in a lobby. But I think what's most notable about the way that Envy played particularly was on their attack, and that was how they put Patipan on the side of their opponent in really awkward positions. They were using their utility very well in coordination with each other, whether we're talking the suppress from the KO, whether we're talking the nanos from the killjoy, whatever it might be. It meant that in those really early engagements at the start of the round, where you're looking for your duelist to get those early picks, they were forcing Patipan out of these positions that he wanted to be in, and he had to move. Whereas Ye didn't have that. So Ye had a really great advantage in early engagements. We also saw them implement a pretty successful force buy on Acend in round 2. So I think while that's not a huge deal, it's definitely something that's worth noting. If a team can force buy well, then they can really screw up the economy of their opponent. However, I think one of my concerns with Envy was that they needed better contingencies for when things weren't necessarily going well. So in the case of Breeze, their B-site defenses were particularly weak, and X10 were very good at just kind of brute forcing their way through. And then they would find that all they needed were like cages placed up on the B side, and that was kind of enough to stop Envy from pushing in, especially if they also had a Viper's Wall as well. And that was something that Envy took quite some time to really be able to do much about. They weren't that great at dealing with those B side pushes on Breeze. Likewise, if you look towards Acend, when Envy were on the attack, they were really struggling to push mid and would find themselves being picked off again and again. And it took them a while, and it took them attack pause to actually get back to a point where they did feel that they could do that. While that's fantastic that they could regain that, it's still rounds that they're giving away, and I think Acend are definitely a team who might be able to take advantage of that. So in terms of expectations and what I would look to for these two teams going up against each other, firstly, the matchup between Ye and CNED has to be a really big one. I do feel that they have different playstyles, but it's going to be really interesting to see how they compare to each other. Both of them very notably do really well for opening engagements, but I'm really curious as to whether or not the pressure of having Zeke as well is going to give Acend an edge in that factor, because Acend more typically will play that double duelist, whereas Envy are less likely to. So they don't have quite the same pressure coming in. They're using their players in different ways. That said, you obviously also have this thing from Envy where they are really investing utility into making those opening engagements hard for the duelist of the opposing team. So while they might not have a second duelist working against CNED, they will likely be investing the utility from someone like Victor into enabling the way that Ye is playing against CNED. So those are two things coming against each other, and I'm curious to see what would win out in that scenario. Definitely want to see if both teams will be able to use that same aggressive defensive style that they both used in their first games of Champions, because part of the reason why they were each able to do that so well against Vivo Keyed and X10 respectively is because their opponent were giving them that space and weren't necessarily putting up anything to stop them from doing that. But if both of these teams can do that, then it's probably more likely that that's going to be quite hard. I mean, imagine that you're Acend and you're looking to push up really early for those aggressive defenses, and then you come across a guy like Marv who's just chilling there. waiting for you to do that. I mean, we saw what he could do yesterday on Acend, for example, just chilling down in Gelato. Like, that's a very difficult position to be in if you're the defender and you're going up against someone like Marved who will punish you for that. That's something that wasn't necessarily happening yesterday in those games. So I'm curious to see if that's actually going to force more passive defenses from these two teams out from each other. But on the topic of defenses, I'm definitely interested to see if Envy struggle to create contingencies again, like, are their defenses going to suffer? Because I think given that Acend have some very strong attacking rounds, they would definitely be able to implement some of that same strategy that X10 did, where they can kind of brute force their way in or find those weak spots that they can exploit to actually get their way onto a site and then stop Envy from really being able to do much about it. And I think Envy are going to have to be a lot faster at adapting if they are to stop that from being a problem. And the last thing that I'm really curious to see how it's going to show up against each other is both of these teams use quite different types of compositions. Envy usually have a lot of information on their team, so they'll have combinations of Sova, Skye, Killjoy, now KO as well. Occasionally they'll use a Cypher, but Acend are way less likely to lean on this kind of composition. Instead, they're probably more likely to bring two duelists, definitely have a Sage as well. And then if you're looking on the controller side of things, on Envy, you're definitely more likely to see something like an Astra, whereas that's not necessarily what Acend would bring. So things like mirror matchups, I think, are incredibly unlikely between these two teams, and that for sure means that we're going to see a difference in how, I don't know, just in how their methodology works anyway. I spoke a little bit earlier about how in those opening engagements, you probably more expect Acend to use this, we have two duelists, we're going to pressure you idea. Whereas on the side of Envy, it's like, well, we only have one duelist, but we're going to throw a ton of utility at you that's going to make it hard for you to use both of yours. So different ideas being implemented on both sides, and I'm definitely curious to see how that's going to turn out. But those are my thoughts on the Acend versus Envy matchup. It's been a bit strange because this is not the video that I planned to do. I thought it was going to be Envy versus Vivo keyed, and I know it's been a controversial decision, but assuming that the Acend versus Envy game does go ahead, these are potentially some of the things that I expect to happen. So thank you so much for watching my video. I've been posting a ton of content on Twitter and Instagram, but I'm going to continue to try and make video content about Champions as the tournament goes on, because, I mean, I've just been sitting here glued to the screen all day since it started. Yay! All right, thank you guys so much for coming back to my channel and watching my video. Let me know your thoughts down below, and I will see you very soon. Goodbye.